So welcome everyone to our chat series. This is all about leadership, and chat stands for Conversations in Healthcare, Academia, and Teaching. This is CME accredited, and so if you're collecting CME credits, you're in luck. And we're really excited to have you here tonight. This is the second of our series for chat in leadership specifically. We have run other chat series in women leadership, and we also have up and coming chat series in entrepreneurship and several other areas. How this evening is going to be structured is it's as conversational as possible. However, before we dive into the main topic of interest today, which is leads, we're going to just make sure that we're going through all the appropriate preliminary motions. So I'd like to start this off with a land acknowledgement for the city of Hamilton. Although we are all situated in different areas at the moment, this is where McMaster University is located, and so I'll just take a moment now to acknowledge the land and everything that has happened to us on this territory. Okay, thank you very much. In terms of conflicts of interest, there are no conflicts to disclose. I myself am an assistant professor of medicine at the Michael G. DeGroot School of Medicine. I teach entrepreneurship and innovation, and I am one of the co-facilitators of the Bridging Leaders program. I am joined here by two of my co-facilitators, Teresa Chan and Sandra Romelli, and we are going to be helping to facilitate dialogue tonight. Our individual of interest, or guest of honor, if you will, is Graham Dixon. Graham Dixon is a professor emeritus at Royal Roads University in Canada. He is an expert in Leads framework. He actually co-developed it, and currently he's working as a senior research advisor to the Canadian Society of Physician Leaders, the CSPL, as well as the Canadian Health Leadership Network. He really is quite strongly involved in the Leads Collaborative, and as he mentioned, he is leading several efforts to have Leads embedded, introduced in many different formats within the healthcare landscape. On to this evening. This is, again, a highly interactive form of delivery. We do want you to engage with one another, especially in the small breakout discussions, which start off around 8:20. We'll let you sit with those groups for a few minutes, so 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll wrap things up, debrief a little bit, reflect on the key insights that we had from our discussions, and conclude with having a bit of a podcasted discussion for those who want to stick around for about half an hour after our 9 o'clock session is completed. The inspiration behind this series of sessions, I think, is important to make note of before we dive into the content, because we are trying to do something a little bit different. Within the leadership landscape, there's always a lot of different programs that talk about several topics, including how to lead, how to be a visionary, how to manage teams, how to negotiate, how to have critical discussions about difficult topics. However, there is unfortunately a lack currently of leadership training in areas where you have to interface between two different spaces. And within the academic setting, the medical school specifically, we did identify that there is an unaddressed leadership gap for those who work both in the hospital setting and in the academic setting. There are different priorities, leadership roles become very complex, and so this multi-institutional lens is required for us to be able to do our jobs effectively. And so through these chats, which are complementary to the Bridging Leaders program, the sessions that we have on a monthly basis, the goal of these specific chats is to keep bringing in people together, to expand networks, to expand our offerings also to people who are outside of the academic institution. And through having these conversations and through having guest speakers such as Graham tonight, we're able to share expertise, we're able to discuss various leadership topics, learn from one another, and ultimately build our shared capacity to overcome various barriers. So with that, I would love to introduce you to Graham Dixon. Again, he is an extraordinary leader, expert in the Leads framework, and he's going to be talking all about the power of the Leads in a caring environment framework. Take it away, Graham.
Thank you, Sarah. And your introduction actually gave me pause because having been from an academic environment, where indeed I was asked to go to help set up the master's program in leadership at Railroads University. I do understand what you said was the lack of leadership in academia. And to be clear, I did that by coming out of government. I was working in government at the time in a policy role. And when I was asked to go out to Railroads and set up this program, it was really an interesting experience for me because it reflects on the comments that you made. It's because I started to think to myself, long and hard, what qualities of leadership inspired me? What qualities of leadership gave me the freedom to do my best work? What qualities of leadership are required for any of us who work in a knowledge-based society to give our best to whatever endeavor it is we're involved with? And that's what motivated me to go out to Railroads University. And I could argue, in a sense, has motivated me ever since, because that was 1996, to really delve into this topic of leadership. And tonight, the primary topic is the LEADS framework itself. And the reason for that is very simple. When it was initially thought about, LEADS was a way of characterizing the standards and expectations of leadership for senior leaders in British Columbia who were in the process in 2004 at the time of going through regionalization. BC went from 54 regions with small hospitals and communities and some large hospitals in urban centers, of course, to 6 health authorities, which it currently has remained at. And at the time, the deputy minister said, do we have the leadership and the qualities of leadership to ensure that those new corporate entities, those new 6 regions, were going to be successful? And that's what actually gave rise to LEADS, because we had a symposium and then a very extensive research project to identify the qualities that would help leaders in making those new regions work. You might ask yourself, well, how are LEADS and leadership applicable to the physician community? And I would argue that today, leadership in the context of what is asked of physicians is absolutely vital. Peter Angood wrote this book entitled All Physicians Are Leaders. Peter is the CEO of the American Association of Physician Leadership and a colleague of mine in an enterprise called the World Federation of Medical Managers, which is an attempt for us to connect across international borders around the topic of physician leadership. And Peter said that all physicians are leaders, but he did give us a caveat. And he said, yes, you can all be leaders if you have the skills to be effective leaders. One cannot assume that without a certain skill set, that one can be effective at leadership. And I'm reminded of one physician who I interviewed at one point in time saying to me in great frustration, he said, you know, Graham, he said, 6 months ago, I was a world-class neurosurgeon. But today, and he had just been appointed to a board, he said, I feel like I'm a bumbling idiot in a boardroom. There is lots to learn about leadership. And all of us, physicians included, who, by the way, I think have a real advantage over many others in because many physicians assume they have a leadership role, that it still is essential that we all learn what good leadership is and practice it accordingly. One of the lessons I'd like to leave you with is that spending time reflecting on your experience of leadership is one of the most important ways to learn it. And I was doing that a while back and suddenly realized that LEADS actually came from an encounter I had with the vice president academic at Railroads University. As we were having a discussion about the future of the institution, he got frustrated and he said, what this university needs more of is leadership. And then he paused for a moment and he said, but what is leadership? He says, to me, it's kind of like fog. You can feel it and you can see it, but you can't grab a hold of it. And I realized then, as if we were going to articulate the qualities of leadership needed for the larger regional health authorities in BC, we were going to have to define leadership. And that's what essentially led us to create the LEADS framework, which has now been described and talked about in 2 books, one in 2014 with my colleague Bill Thal, and the other most recently published in 2020, where we describe how LEADS is being used across the country in almost every province because it has been endorsed for use in almost every province. We define leadership in the book slightly differently than most people would, I guess. A lot of people would go to the literature and get a definition from the literature, but we decided to do it in a different way. And that way we decided to do was to ask an anthropologist to find out what different groups of people in different ethnic communities and countries thought the word leader meant. So this anthropologist gathered all the words in different cultures that had or meant leadership or similar skill set, and we analyzed them for what they meant. The second thing we did was to look at advertising slogans in the private sector, primarily in the private sector, because a lot of companies use, we're the leading voice in X or a leading company in Y. And we realized that they were using that word because it meant something very special to people. So we analyzed how it was used in advertisements. And we essentially came up with the following definition for leadership in healthcare. So it is the collective capacity of an individual, all their skill sets, or group, to influence people to work together to achieve a common constructive purpose. And in the case of healthcare, the health and wellness of the population we serve. Now, note that we all serve in different roles and in different places and different populations. Whether you're a formal leader or an informal leader, there is a population that you serve. And your leadership should be focused on that population. And you'll note, too, that it is very much an altruistic definition of leadership. It's not one that says leadership is about aggrandizing power for the sake of status and money. It is one about serving the needs of people in a universal health system. Now, Sarah asked me to say a few words about the difference between leadership and management. And to me, this is actually quite an important thing to point out to people, because often people think the word manager and the word leader are synonymous. But just think back to that notion of advertising slogans. Suppose, the advertising slogan, instead of being, a leading car manufacturer, was a managing car manufacturer. I don't think a lot of people would be drawn to the second of those two advertising slogans. Leadership has implicit in it a set of skills that are dramatically different and capabilities to the skills of management. In fact, leadership is the concept that we all understand as standing in the front, meeting unknown challenges. Leaders stand in the front, meeting challenges that we haven't solved yet. Managers build the way to solve those problems once we know how to solve those problems. Management is applied in very predictable, stable environments where we can understand what actually has to happen. Leadership is applied and used in times of rapid change to help us figure out where we should go and how we should get there. The challenge is it's very hard sometimes to know when to use one or the other, and where does one start and the other end. In fact, another author, a gentleman called Jeremy Braithwaite from Australia, the University of New South Wales, wrote a fascinating article, and this is the title of the article. And what it means is leadership in health is not equal to, you can hardly see that little vertical slash through the equal sign, but it is a not equal to sign, the sum of all management, M1, M2, M to the ultimate circumstance. In fact, he went on to say that over-management, micromanagement, too much management kills the ability to exercise leadership. And if you think about it, it is because if we indulge management too much, we begin to rely too much on set policies, set procedures, set practices that crowd out any creativity and ability to adapt to new circumstance. And so it is very important to understand that all of us who wish to be involved in wherever the health system is going need to have both the skills of leadership and the skills of management. So I should spend, obviously, a few minutes speaking about what LEADS actually is. When we did the work in 2006 originally, and done some more work in 2007 across the country, and another reboot kind of in 2018, we looked at what the literature had to say about leadership. We did a number of lit reviews. We interviewed people and we did focus groups to get a pot of data, which we then triangulated. And that created 5 domains of leadership practice and 20 capabilities, that's 4 each, of leadership action. And each capability starts with the verb, and the acronym LEADS itself stands for L, lead self, E, engage others, A, achieve results, D, develop coalitions, and S, systems transformation. And here you see it, and this is what I asked Sarah to put into your chat box, so you can download the 5 domains and 20 capabilities of LEADS. And I'd ask you to do that because when we get to the questions in the breakout rooms, I'd like you to play a little with seeing if you can see some relationship between some of the experiences you're having in leadership with LEADS. Beneath LEADS, philosophically and practically, we realized that it was absolutely fundamental that the actual name of the framework is LEADS in a caring environment capabilities framework. And that was because we realized at a particular point of time in our work that healthcare is a unique endeavor. It is unlike no other, and it is not a business. Well, there are business requirements, of course, associated with it. But leadership in healthcare must be by health and for health, and it must be guided by caring and compassion, which means the practices of leadership, both for providers and patients and families and citizens, should be expressed in a caring way. As I said, we wanted a framework that was by health and for health, that had the what I would call the face validity of when someone in healthcare picked up the framework, they could see their experience in the language of the framework itself. It must reflect and had to reflect that noble sense of authentic and servant leadership, that we're here to serve others in a universal healthcare system. And the leadership expectations of all of us have to reflect that goal. And finally, because of the systemic nature of healthcare, the multiplicity of organizations, institutions, and professions, leadership had to be understood from the perspective of being shared and distributed amongst many different people to make the system work rather than simply the purview of an individual. So Leeds explored those notions and brought them to light as well. Leeds also recognizes what I call the interconnectedness of self and system. And what I mean by that is essentially one cannot separate oneself out of a system's challenges and problems, and nor can one separate a system's challenges and problems out of the individual that we are ourselves. Confucius said the following: those who anciently wished to exemplify illustrious virtue to the whole world, and I consider health and wellness illustrious virtue, first ordered their own state. CEO of a region, say, needs to order his or her state. Wishing to order their states, they first regulated their family. Wishing to regulate their families, they first cultivated their own characters. Wishing to cultivate their characters, they rectified their hearts. And wishing to rectify their hearts, they first made their thoughts sincere, self. Wishing to make their thoughts sincere, they first extended their knowledge to the utmost, looking outwards of self, into the system. This extending of their knowledge to the utmost lay in the investigation of things, understanding the system of which we're a part. That zooming in and zooming out from self to system is how leadership must be practiced, and Leeds captures that from the first domain, Leeds self, to the final domain, systems transformation. One last point that I want to make to you is the question is often, the comment is often made that leaders are born, not made. And of course, leaders are born, we all are, but they are also made. Leadership, as this statement from Kouzes and Posner states, leadership is an art, a performing art, and the instrument is the self. And what they mean by that is that when you adopt the mantle of leadership, you have to perform for others. And performing for others, doing for others, demands that you use all the skills and all the instruments at your disposal. And in the case of leadership, the instrument is your personality, your belief systems, your biases, if you have any, your skill sets. Who you are is the leader you are. And therefore, you need to take charge of your own leadership development. You can develop the lead's capabilities and domains by simply using the strengths you bring to the table as a unique individual in this healthcare system. And the developmental processes implicit in your program, I think, from what I've heard, and in any good leadership development program, will encourage you to do just that. So that is about as quick an overview as Leeds as I can give you. I'm, of course, very keen on hearing your questions or comments. Sarah and I did decide that it would be a good idea to have some breakout rooms. And we have 3 questions for you. So it says, and I don't know how much time is available for that, Sarah, but I thought that each breakout room could choose one of these 3 questions to focus on, whichever one they were most comfortable with. Make sure, please, everybody, just pick one question and play with it. Just play with it. And if you have other questions you want to ask me that come out of your discussion, great. But please choose a reporter from the 2 breakout rooms to at least give us a sense of what your answer to the question was before we throw it open to comments and broader questions.
Come back and chat about the insights that we had from the conversations. Did anyone tackle the questions, or did we focus on talking about leadership and what we heard? Okay, who wants to share?
Aravind, he wants to share.
Nice.
No, we had a great, so we sort of went for the more conversational approach, but actually it was a great discussion. So I learned a lot. So I really appreciated the time with Sandra and Brian. So I opened with, in reviewing the LEADS framework, and I had originally considered it, as Sandra had pointed out, from a more linear perspective. So sort of starting with L, and I had asked, well, how do you identify if you've become a strong enough leader of self to then move towards being a leader of others? Or reframing the question, if you are a leader of others, at what point do you look and say, I'm probably not capable enough to lead others because I need to focus on leading self, which led into a bit of a discussion. And some quick context is I had made a choice at one point to step down or step back from a role of chair to a more operational role. And that's where Brian had pointed out that maybe sometimes, even in a leadership role, when you think you need to bring your 100% best self, maybe you can't, but you might still be the right person for a role, or that might be part of persevering in the role of leadership. So I guess that was if we had to sum up 15 minutes in 30 seconds, that would be the summary. But the question, Graham, is sort of twofold. One, is the LEADS framework linear? And whether linear or not, how do you hold the leadership of self in conjunction with leadership of others?
Great questions, both of them. And I will say that it can be linear and it can be interdependent, if you want to use that terminology. In real life, 1 minute you may be reflecting inwards on your own emotional response to a situation you're experiencing. The L, the manages self, for example, capability. And then have to shift immediately to developing coalitions. In other words, okay, I've now managed my emotional response to the individual representing the organization I'm sitting at the table with who upset me. But I'd better now purposely build a coalition with that person because that person's organization is fundamentally important for the patients and citizens that we're trying to serve through this coalition. So it is an interdependent framework also in the notion that you can't do systems transformation without a robust self-leadership commitment, if you like. You can't build coalitions without high engage others skill sets. All of those are required to achieve results. So you can see the interdependency of the framework. On the other hand, you can see it linear as well, in that you could say, as I'm planning a project out, I should think first of all, well, what are my values and why am I committed in my vision for this project? Self. Who do I need to engage to move this project into the next phase or step? What results do we want to achieve in pursuing this project? Are there outside agencies that we can work with to really get this project off the ground? And finally, what are the change, the innovations, the critical thinking that are going to be required to ensure that this project is sustained into the system in which we wish it to be part? So you can use LEADS linearly, or you can see it as an interdependent set of skill sets that are applied as the situation emerges. So that's question number one. Question number two, around self-leadership. And I kind of heard two facets to it. And that is, should you take on leadership challenges if you don't think you're up to them? That was one. And secondly, you should be looking inwards to at least understand why and prepare for whatever challenges you're going to take on. And you said the part of your response also was, is there a basic level of self that you can bring to the task of leadership? And I would say to the latter, no. I would say that any leader who is evolving in their career is constantly discovering things about self, is constantly challenging one's own belief systems to ensure that they're entering into a new challenge or initiative with the right attitude and the right belief. You've heard the phrase, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, that happens if you don't continually look inside to remind yourself of why you have the power and how to use it judiciously for the purpose of serving others. So self-introspection, if you like, is demanded of all leaders at all times and never stops growing if you operationalize it. By the way, your questions are themselves a reflection of the lead self domain. So thank you for doing that.
Our group would probably kind of dabble a little bit more in the engage others of the, like in the E, when we were talking about leadership and management, the difference, we started there. But Ashley came in and just, there's a pearl I want to share because, and maybe actually you should share because I don't want to share on your behalf. She talked about the way that she's been interacting with her students with strength-based education. And I was just like, that's basically really aligned with transformational leadership, that idea of like, how do you leverage the strengths of your team? And I thought that was a really good pearl. So Ashley, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
I had essentially spoken to a strength-based approach with my students. And so as opposed to seeing the deficits as some people might claim them to be, I try to really emphasize their strengths and build upon them. And then I find that by the end, they rise up to be just a phenomenal rising star in the end. I apologize. You probably would have done a better job at summarizing than me, but
that was perfect. I mean, I think it pulls a lot of those threads in when you're engaging others. Like, and Juan and David reflected a lot about the idea that when you're entering a new domain, leadership is so contextual. If you don't understand the system that you're entering, then things fall apart. And you have to know the players. You have to understand your team. You have to, as Juan put it, his musician came out in him. He had a really good analogy. Juan, do you want to explain your analogy there?
For sure, yeah. So it appealed to me, the analogy, because when you're in the stage, right? So you have to engage with your audience, right? So and if you don't have that connection with your audience, you don't enjoy it. So you have your team, which is your group, your musician players, right? So but you need to have that connection, right? So and as I was telling, you have good gigs, bad gigs, right? So and you need to reflect what went wrong, right? So what was the issue that made that happen, and applies to leadership as well. So,
well, remember, Juan, the statement I made near the end: that leadership is an art, a performing art, and it is absolutely true. In fact, I would bet that if you're a musician on stage and you sense that the audience is not liking what you're doing as much as you want them to like what you're doing, you automatically try to compensate for that by doing something a little different.
Correct.
It's kind of like being on stage as an actor. You get energy from the audience. And if your performance isn't meeting their needs, then you adapt on the spot, so that the audience is comfortable with your performance and is enjoying your performance. And it is the same with leadership. Leadership doesn't exist without followers, as Sarah and I were talking about. And followers become engaged by the leader knowing who they are and what engages them. Like a musician knows what engages his or her audience. And that was what I appreciated about what David had to say. If you don't know what your followers, who your followers are, what motivates your followers, what they need from you, it's really hard to engage them. And that's the essence of the engage others domain of leadership. Oh, and Ashley, I want to comment on the strengths-based approach. That also speaks to knowing your followers, right? You can't build on their strengths if you don't know what they are. And we do write about that in chapter 5 of our book, is a fundamentally important attribute of developing leaders. Because, we use the little story about the hare the tortoise that had to take remedial classes in running because he wasn't fast enough, and the hare that had to take remedial courses in swimming because he was fast, but he hated swimming. So instead of being able to perform as a swimmer or as a runner, he had to learn to perform as a swimmer. Dropped out of school very quickly. We only need to develop our weaknesses when they are getting in the way of doing our job at a reasonable level. The rest of the time, we should be putting our energies in developing our strengths. And remember, I said in Lead Self, knowing your strengths is the key to enhancing your own leadership capability, because the leader you are is the person you are. Grow who you are into your leadership role.
Amazing discussion. So I want to transition this into the podcast episode. And so really it doesn't yield much of a difference in the dynamic of the conversation, other than I just wanted to flag that we're transitioning into that. And so you will be recorded as we continue to record. We didn't stop. So it's just going to continue as is. However, I will just do a quick intro of the session, introduce Graham again, and then we'll keep going on with the conversation. All right, so welcome to the next podcast from the Leadership Chat series. We're here with Dr. Graham Dixon, who's a leader in Leeds and a professor emeritus at the Royal Roads University in Canada. We've got a bunch of folks here with us tonight from the Leadership Chat discussion, and we're really keen to have all of you here for this post-chat series engagement. So thanks so much, Dr. Graham Dixon, for being part of this conversation with us. We've learned so much from you already. My own personal reflections from our conversation were around the different styles of leadership. So a little bit about being a command and control leader versus an affiliative leader versus coaching leader, democratic leader, a pace-setting leader, a visionary leader. And I think I learned quite a bit from our very short conversation, just how some of those styles are more likely to yield followership and some of them are likely to succeed, but in very certain contexts. I wonder if you could build on that a little bit.
Sure, it's Graham here. And I was actually quoting the work of Daniel Goleman, who has spent a huge amount of time studying the concept of emotional intelligence. And he turned his research into understanding leaders needing to understand that different styles of leadership respond to the needs of followers, depending on the situation or circumstance you're in. Two of those styles, what he called coercive or command and controls and pace setting, are two styles that essentially say to the follower, do it my way, follow me because I have all the answers, which immediately says to the follower, my opinion isn't valued, my perspective isn't valued, and you're not doing this for me. The other four styles, the affiliative, coaching, democratic, and visionary, in particular the visionary, which says we are doing it for each other for a bigger purpose, show consideration for the aspirations of the followers and allow them to help shape the future. They're engaged through those four styles in shaping the future. And as a consequence, those four styles are much more in demand than the pace setting and the command and control. Those latter two styles are the styles, however, that people need in times like crisis, like the pandemic crisis. Now, they don't need it. They need it at the beginning of the pandemic crisis and at stages through it, but they don't need it throughout. In other words, the command and control style and the pace setting style, pace setting in the realm of vaccines, for example, command and control in setting social rules around the pandemic, are necessary. Once they are in place, however, the other four styles are necessary to keep people engaged, to show that you still care about them and consider them in the decision-making that you're doing. If all your decisions come from a mount on high and are interpreted as do it because I want you to do it, then you will see segments of the population simply refusing to comply with the decisions made by the leader. So the style, the style idea is you adapt your style to the needs of the follower. And it is a very, very important concept, I think, for successful engagement of others.
It actually resonates with me a lot. This is Teresa, by the way. And I've been on this podcast before, actually. I'm the host of the podcast most of the time. So you may have heard my voice, but I was just fascinated by what you've just said, because I think it really interfaces with another model called the Cynefin model.
Yes, it does.
Right? The idea of in chaotic situations, which is like the beginning of a pandemic, you really need to take control, because chaos needs that. It begs for that control. I think about myself as an emerge doc. A chaotic trauma room, when someone's first arriving and is very sick, needs command and decision making, and we can't have a democratic vote about whether or not to start an IV. Like, it's just not going to be the best case scenario with a goal that we all actually implicitly want by showing up to work, which is to save patients' lives when they roll in an emergency situation. And so I like the idea of like figuring out the context, and that includes all of your, other people in the context, your followers. But it also includes the threats from outside as well, right? So The other domains of the Cynefin framework, just for the podcast listeners, are complicated, complex, and then simple. In simple, you can just follow best practices, but in the other ones, you sometimes need to pull out other stops.
Well, it's Graham again, and Teresa, that's fascinating. You made that connection as well, because I was actually writing a paper this morning, and someone made that connection for me in feedback on my paper, which is absolutely fascinating. And there is another little theory that I'll throw into the mix, written about years ago. It's called the theory of the zone of acceptance of leadership by a fellow called Herbert Simon. And he studied organizations. So he was looking at the ability of the leader to keep people engaged and to accept the decision that the leader made. And he called it, every leader has a zone of acceptance implicit in, granted to them by the followers. And what that he meant was that within certain boundaries, the follower says, I will accept any decision you make within these parameters. And anytime you make a decision within those parameters, the zone of acceptance widens. Every time you make a decision that falls outside the zone of acceptance, the parameters narrow. So his guidance and advice to the leader was always know your zone of acceptance of your followers. What will they expect me to use a command and control approach? For what decisions do they expect me to do that? For what decisions, if I make them, say with a command and control project, and it falls outside, what are the implications? I'm going to lose credibility with my followers. So knowing the styles and knowing what your followers will accept, and knowing the contexts in which those decisions are being made, complex, chaotic, simple, or complicated, is an interesting dance of ideas that I think the more a leader spends figuring out that and understanding how their followers think of their leadership, the more important it becomes for them.
Those are really wise words. That's all I can say and react to it. It's just, it synthesizes a lot of different concepts together and bringing it all into a space that often when you're in the middle of it all, in the middle of even not a chaotic situation, but even just a complicated situation, it can be really hard to do that zooming out that you talked about earlier during your talk, right? And so how do you do that? How do you suggest that we actually do that? How do you zoom out in the moment? Because that's, to me, a great challenge, I think.
Well, you see, I think most of the leadership approaches that are taken are in either the simple or complicated dimensions of the Cynefin framework. And they are characteristic of how we determine policies, how we implement policies, how we analyze data and make decisions. And we do it with the mindset primarily of simple and complicated systems. If you think of the complex system, where the complexity is such that there are so many different viewpoints and perspectives and variables that may lead to a solution, unlike when simple and complicated, when you can actually isolate those variables and make decisions accordingly. You have to use different leadership approaches. You have to use what I call systems leadership or organic systems leadership approaches, where you engage large numbers of people in a very disciplined way to both identify what the problem is and potential solutions to the problem. There's a marvelous book, and I thought I had it in front of me, but I don't, and it's called The Change Handbook. There's a new version coming out. It was produced, I think, in 2006, and it presents you with 85 systems thinking models of engaging people from all facets of a problem into a structured, disciplined process of engagement. Things like open space, things like search conferences, where you invite, for example, patients and family members and community members, and you create, as a leader, you create a container to begin to say to people, you have, because you own the implementation of the solution, you have to help craft what you're going to commit to do. And as a leader, you have to give up control in those kind of situations, the typical control of position and authority to control of the process. And I think it is fundamentally important in healthcare in particular that leaders become much more aware of those kind of tools that they can use to generate decisions that followers will then implement. We do that so rarely, it's no wonder that we're constantly seeking and having to deal with unhappy patients and citizens because they never get a real voice in where the system is going.
Graham, I'm kind of curious. Aravind here, McMaster alumni. I mean, based on what you and Teresa said about different leadership styles, different frameworks, you know, in your opinion, would you say that some of the best leaders are able to then articulate, you know, post situation or post scenario, I saw this chaotic situation or I saw this type of structure, and therefore I believe that this leadership style was most appropriate? Would that be an ideal sort of post-mortem for a leader to take? Is that even possible?
Yes, I do think that, you know, I said earlier that I think the best way to learn leadership is in the doing of it. And I think the best way then to learn it is to reflect on it, reflect on your experiences, journaling, deliberate efforts to unpack a situation that maybe went awry for you and to figure out alternatives about how you might have handled it. After action reviews with a trusted friend that says, this is what I went through, this is what happened, what do you think, and how might I do it differently the next time? Part of being an effective leader is a commitment to deep learning of self and of organization, by the way. Organizations need to do more of this kind of learning which was talked about earlier on by people like Peter Senge, who wrote the fifth discipline on systems models to help with organizational learning. So any good leader will build into their day, into their way of operating, a process of constant ongoing reflection and learning on the experiences they had, and then seeking new and different ways to expand their toolkit.
That reflection cycle is so important, right? Like Shun talks about the reflective practitioner, regardless of whether you're a doctor or an Olympic cyclist or a leader in this case, you need to do that, close that loop. You need to get to the point where you can reflect both after action, but then eventually, hopefully, in action. And that's a really big part of what you can do when you are honing this craft of reflection. And that mindfulness part is really important to really assess the situation as well. I mean, all of this is so aligned with growth mindset and so many of those other things that we've been talking about in education. Is really, really energizing to see it migrating probably back and forth between leadership and education. And in academia, we often have to wrestle with both at the same time. So it's great to know that a lot of the tricks we use as teachers, we can actually use them as leaders, because it's the same basic psychology and sociology and anthropology. We're still just influencing and helping other people, right?
You're right, Teresa. And isn't it interesting that you brought the learning literature to the table? You could also bring the PDSA cycle that we employ in healthcare to the table as another example of a learning cycle. Experiential leadership as a learning cycle that Lewin talked about. And action research, which is a research methodology, which in essence is a cycle of learning in situ for large issues and concerns. And this is one of the things that I find very, very interesting is because we're academics, we get locked into fields and disciplines. And we often don't look for the synergy between the similar concepts that are expressed in a jargonistic way in this discipline, but different in another. And I think leaders have to constantly look for the commonalities across disciplines to bring people together to solve problems, rather than let people indulge themselves in their jargon and their unique disciplines that they like to say is the only one that can solve this problem. And that's part of the challenge sometimes physicians face, because sometimes physicians want the medical solution to be the solution without looking to other disciplines to work with the medical solution to bring the solution to the problem. Any other comments? Questions?
Does anyone else have? I'm just like bathing in wisdom right now. Just soaking it all in. Anyone have questions?
Hi, it's Brian. Just a quick question. How do you foster your constructive critics? I've had the rare pleasure for a number of years of having had a critic within my department whom I just wanted to do a study on because he was so good. He could depersonalize the criticism. It was about the idea, not the individual, not about a group of individuals, but just take a concept that was trying to be introduced. And it was so fun to go to him first to bring that concept, those ideas forward,
yes.
And then have him shoot holes through it. And if it could still float, great. And if it couldn't, it was going back to the scrap heap. But that I learned to value that criticism so much. But it was a rare type of individual who could do it so constructively.
So the question is, how do you foster such constructive criticism in others?
Yes.
Well, first, I think you have to develop a relationship with those people. Again, it's interesting because this morning I sent out part of that paper I'm writing to two people I really trust to give me constructive criticism. And because I trust them so well, the skill set that you described wasn't necessary. They didn't have to give me any kind of, soften the blow kind of approaches. But I think if you want to foster that in others, what you have to do is invite them in to give criticism. And often, sometimes, by the way, you offer them the opportunity to give a criticism, and then coach them if needed be on, do you want to know my response to your feedback? My response to your feedback is, initially I was a bit put off because it was pretty assertive and I was a little defensive. And then I kind of overcame my defensiveness, and I realized that some of the things you were saying were really important for me to understand. So thank you for that. That brings to the attention of that person that maybe the approach that they took could be altered a little to have a more constructive effect. Because in the absence of a good relationship, you're going to have to be very careful about how you give constructive feedback. By the way, I think some of the people who give constructive feedback do it best when they offer the opportunity to the other person to receive feedback. And if the other person says, no, I'm not in a space to get it, they defer and don't push it on them. And I think I would suggest that you say to everybody, offer to give feedback first. And if it's not welcome, don't give it until the person's ready for it. I don't know. Does that help? Is it Brian?
Yes, and that is good. It was. I know I wasn't very effective, as you're suggesting, at that communication. When that individual finally left the department, which I was very sad about, he just said he could never figure out our relationship. I was always praising him, and all he was doing was criticizing me, and he never realized how much I valued his criticism.
Well, it's really interesting. I remember observing a CEO and his executive team presenting a strategic plan to 200 managers of a very large organization. And they then stopped after having presented the plan and said, now we'd invite feedback from the audience. So about 5 different managers got up and said, oh, Mr. President, what a great presentation. Really appreciate what you're doing in the strategic plan for this organization. And then the 6th person got up and he said, Mr. President, executive team, thank you for your presentation, but I want you to know that none of the suggestions that you've made for the ongoing future of this company will ever be implemented by the workers in this company. Are you aware, sir, of the morale that is at rock bottom and the complete lack of energy of the working person inside this corporation? And you could see the CEO's neck flush red, the cords stood out, and he hammered his fist on the table and he leaned into the mic and he said, thank you for your feedback. Anybody else? Do you think there was any more feedback? No. So maybe one should also really look carefully at how one receives feedback in terms of the message they're giving as they receive it. If it's perceived as, indulging defensiveness or criticism, then and making the person receiving it unhappy, then people will stop giving you constructive feedback.
It's a really good piece of advice there. And I think with that, we have had quite the oversaturation of wisdom for a session. And thank you again, Dr. Graham Dixon, for joining us for a great conversation on not just the LEADS framework, but also just leadership in general, sharing so much wisdom that you've accumulated over the years and allowing us to engage with you in a collaborative discussion where we can also learn from each other.